We have the great honor of having Stephen J. Diner, a university professor at Rutgers University-Newark, come to visit us this afternoon. It's an honor for me also. I've known Steve for many years as a friend and colleague at Rutgers Newark, and as someone who cares deeply about universities and their roles in their cities. At Rutgers University-Newark, he's devoted himself to building a leading urban research institution. You know, you listen to Steve and he'll tell you that there's no reason that you can't build a world-class research institution in an urban university. During every year of his tenure as Chancellor, which was from July 2002 to December 2011, Rutgers University was named one of the racial and ethnic, was one of the #1 in racial and ethnic diversity among national universities as ranked by U.S. News and World Report. That's an interesting factoid, but Steve used that ranking to increase the diversity of the faculty, the diversity of offerings, and really use diversity as a singular asset for that institution. Steve started out his career in the District of Columbia, at the University of the District of Columbia. Is that correct, Steve?
That's correct.
And he also has had stints at George Mason University, and then he came to Rutgers University. Steve completed his PhD in history at the University of Chicago, where he did pathbreaking research in the role of University of Chicago professors in public policy in Chicago. He has a number of publications, but I think Steve would also say he's just as proud of his role in building a world-class urban institution at Rutgers University-Newark. So Steve, could you come up and address us?
Thank you, Roland. That's very kind, and I must say I've had a great time these 2 days here, meeting all kinds of people, including some of you who were at earlier presentations. So let me begin by telling you how I got interested in this subject, although it may be probably self-obvious by now. I wrote my first book, as Roland told you, on the role of professors in the rise of progressivism in Chicago. And I also, related some articles on the rise of academic professions, sociology in particular. I also wrote about social work and the like. Then I found myself a faculty member at the University of the District of Columbia, which was an open enrollment, basically brand new urban institution. And my faculty appointment was in urban studies, and so I got very interested in that. In any case, I spent a number of years at George Mason, but then I came to Rutgers University, Rutgers University in Newark, and I was just, when I interviewed there initially for Arts and Science Dean, I told people, oh well, the city of Newark has tremendous possibilities for attracting more students and faculty and research, and a number of people were very pleased, and some looked at me as if I was out of my mind. What? This is Newark, 20 years ago. But my model of the urban university was my doctoral dissertation, the University of Chicago. And, you know, that's how one of the ways it became a great university was by taking advantage of being in Chicago, you know. So that was always my, my model. And then I was dean for 4 years and chancellor for 10 years. And somewhere in the middle of the chancellorship, I began thinking, you know, when I leave this job, I think I want to write a book. You know, I want to return to scholarship. Most former presidents and chancellors don't do that, but I wanted to do that, and I got thinking, no one has written a history of urban universities, so I'll do that. And I plunged into this research, and anyhow, the result is this book. I don't know how interesting that is to anybody, but one of the things that most struck me when I started the research, or when I got into the research, and in particular, I started with the records of the Association of Urban Universities, which was founded in 1914 and then shut down in the late 1970s. But one of the things that just fascinated me and that I didn't know about was the deep anti-urbanism of American higher education, historically. A couple of examples. In 1876, a minister very involved in higher education named Lewis Dunn, Baptist minister, wrote, quote, "Colleges located in quiet rural towns do accomplish much more work and better work than in other localities. And large cities, business centers, places where people congregate should never be chosen as a location for a college." So that was 1876. A couple years later, 1883, another minister named Charles Thwing wrote that a significant number of city-bred college students are immoral on their entering college because the city environment for many of them has been excellent preparatory schools for sophomoric dissipation. And even home influences have failed to outweigh the evil attractions of gambling table and its accessories. In contrast, he said that students from rural settings have been deeply elevated by, quote, "not only the purity of the student's home, but the associations of his country life." He went on to actually say that there are higher rates of immorality among students in colleges located in or near cities. But it's not just these strange 19th century ministers. A university president who later became president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, wrote that college should promote, quote, "liberal culture for a select group of men capable of appreciating moral, intellectual, and aesthetic values. This education would prepare them for national service and civic leadership." But he went on to say, "However, it is not appropriate for the majority who carry forward the common labor of the world." Higher education was not appropriate. "It could be accomplished only in a compact and homogeneous residential college. You cannot go to college on a streetcar and know what college means," said President Wilson. He wasn't then, he was in university, President Wilson. But so, you know, this has deep origins. And it also has origins in the history of some very prominent universities that grew up in cities. Columbia University moved 3 times to escape the city. And the 3rd time it moved to its current location, Morningside Heights, it realized that sooner or later the city would catch up. You know, that cities just kept growing outward. And so what they decided is the next best thing, we'll build a wall around the campus and plant lots of trees. And that way we'll try to protect these students from the evils of the city. University of Pennsylvania pretty much did the same thing. One of my favorites is NYU. NYU had been a kind of quasi-working class institution in the 19th century. But in 1880, it decided that it needed to have a really good full-time residential campus. And you couldn't have that in New York City. So they purchased land overlooking the Hudson River in the countryside, now known as the Bronx. And when I was growing up, by the way, when I was in college, I had friends who went to NYU, and my image of NYU was this Gothic campus overlooking the Hudson River. And needless to say, as the Bronx changed, NYU eventually decided in the 1970s that we can't maintain this campus anymore. And they sold it to Bronx Community College and left. But that was going to be the pure place for raising college students in the country. Another dimension of this is the land grants. Almost no land grant universities were opened in cities. Now, partly there is the agriculture element, but mostly it's because states didn't think cities were the place to open major universities. There were two exceptions, basically the main one was University of Minnesota, and it was opened in Minneapolis. But again, on the edge of the city, and at the time, Minneapolis had 12,000 people, St. Paul had 24,000, and so they didn't go there. But it's reflected also in the location of land grants. Now, the major exception to this was professional schools. From the beginning, it was assumed that formal education in medicine, law in particular, need to be in cities because that's where you have the hospitals, that's where you have the courtrooms and the government agencies and so on. For example, the founding president of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan, he wrote, and he was a great opponent of any kind of undergraduate education in a city. But he wrote in 1903 that, quote, "A college should be in a town so small that college interests overshadow all others. Higher education," he went on, quote, "mostly begins when a boy goes away from home, but you cannot get it on the streetcars. However," he said, "university professional schools may be in a great city." So that's just an example of that. Historically, professional schools were separate from liberal arts colleges, and then over time they merged together. And for many years, you didn't need a baccalaureate degree to go to a law school or a medical school. One of the other interesting developments in all this, despite this prejudice against cities, a whole range of, a number of cities started their own colleges, which were going to be commuter colleges, for their own students. The first one was started in 1837, and it was the College of Charleston. And in 1837. 1847, something called the Free Academy of New York, now known as City College, opened. And in 1871, something called the Female Normal School opened. That was what's today Hunter College. Okay. So there was, there obviously was even early on, some institutions that were serving students in cities. So this in turn raised a big question for the leaders of, quote, urban universities. And in 1914 they formed this Association of Urban Universities, but they would debate, well, how do we deal with this? Cities are not the place to build character, but we're in cities. city students. So how do we deal with this? And in 1917, the dean of Tufts College wrote that his institution had once been rural, but now drew most of its students from Boston and other nearby cities. And he said, students who came to Tufts in the early days came from rustic families. They had a background and ideals very different from those of the students who come to us today. Current students, he observed, come from lower classes, well, his idea of lower classes. They are naturally people without background. They lack imagination. Therefore, although they can apprehend a fact perfectly well, they have had nothing at home, and I fear very little in the schools to prepare them for actual literary work. This is Tufts University. The chancellor, that was 1939, chancellor of the University of Buffalo in 1946, his name's Kenneth Mason. No, not the chancellor, the dean of freshmen at University of Buffalo. He worried that his institution, quote, in common with other institutions located in a like environment, has in her student body too large a proportion of socially undesirable students. He emphatically went on to deny that he was Jew-baiting, which is exactly what he was doing, and he expressed grave concern, quote, about the influx of alien blood into what was not so long ago a homogeneous group of students, prevailingly Baptist and Anglo-Saxon. And he said, the social backgrounds and breeding of many students are such as to make their college training of little value to society. Just one more. The president of Hunter College. So again, we're not just talking about the heads of elite or private institutions. The president of Hunter College, after leaving his position, George Schuster, he wrote an autobiography. He was president from 1939 to 1960, and he wrote this the year after he left. He said, when he assumed the leadership of the college, quote, a large number of the girls who came to Hunter had absorbed a variety of prejudices from home environments, displayed only the rudiments of good manners, spoke English atrociously, and had as little use for honor societies as they did for Herbert Hoover. And he went on, he said that these students, mostly daughters of Jewish immigrants, were, quote, raucous, gaudy, afflicted with acne, halitosis, and deplorable hairdos. Okay, so that's the foundation, if you will. That's the tradition in American higher education. But after World War II, as higher education began to expand enormously, and obviously if it was going to expand more and more, it had to expand in the cities because that's where people were living. So this idea about urban students diminished. It wasn't expressed explicitly. And also, one of the differences is that after World War II, you start getting a different kind of faculty. Among other things, you get a lot of Jews, who go to graduate school, get PhDs, and it's not that they have their own prejudices, but they don't share this idea about city people and immigrants and all the like. But something changed once again in the late 60s and early 70s with the rise of open enrollment. Open enrollment, essentially meant anyone who graduated high school could come to college, and there were quite a few professors who were quite critical of this One of them, whom many of you have probably heard of, was David Reisman, the world-renowned sociologist. And David Reisman wrote that urban commuter students, quote, go home again to their uncomprehending families and their non-college friends, where they are surrounded by people who think liberal education is merely another kind of trade school. So, even in the late 60s, Reisman is saying that. This was not, in fact, it was 1967 when he said this. So all of this, of course, it coincides with a long-standing argument within the leadership of higher education as to what constitutes an urban university. This is this is an issue that goes way, way back, for many people, early on, leaders, some of them said that to be an urban university means that you provide service to your community. Henry Chase, the Chancellor of NYU, wrote in 1939 that being an urban university, quote, does not necessarily mean a university located in a city. Sound familiar? It is not a matter of geography. It is an institution which finds its primary field of service in the community. The president of the University of Buffalo, Chancellor of the University of Buffalo, Samuel Capon, wrote in 1946, term urban university designates something other than the mere accident of location. It has a special obligation to be hospitable to all local requests for those intellectual services which a university may legitimately render. And an article in 1980 in an education journal, which was entitled Toward a Definition of an Urban University, said that an urban university must respond directly to the special needs of its community. Again, something to talk about a lot in this institution and in mine. But another element of this ongoing definition of what makes an institution urban was educating local students. In 1959, the then Chancellor of the University of Buffalo, a man named Furness, said that urban universities are defined because they provide opportunities for low-income students to work while attending college. The Ford Foundation in 1978 started a program of grants in urban higher education. And to be eligible for such a grant, the institution had to be committed to educating primarily local students. That's, So that is an ongoing, and there was federal legislation for urban universities, and again, one of the requirements is the majority of the students had to be local. But despite all of this, the notion of urban university has had a negative implication for much of its history. The term came to mean, or came to be understood, well, an urban university is a university of commuters, of working class students, of immigrants, of students of mediocre academic backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. And this is very strange to me because, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the rise of the University of Chicago and, taking advantage of the city. And so in 1983, I was a faculty member of the University District of Columbia and a chair of the Urban Studies Department, and I was nominated for an American Council on Education Fellowship in administration. It's a special program where you spend a year interning with the president of another university. And so I did that, and I had, like everyone, a series of interviews. One of my interviewers, who was the provost of American University, said to me after my interview with him, "You have a very impressive record. You're going to have a great career ahead of yourself in urban universities." And he started ticking off a dozen or so places with very large minority enrollments. And I said, "Oh, or American University?" He said, "Oh, no, we're not an urban university." And at the time, it utterly baffled me until I started doing this research and figured out what he was saying to me is, "You're a white guy who can teach black students and deal in a black institution." Unfortunately, he didn't put it so explicitly, but surely that was what was in his mind. The Association of Urban Universities, as I said, was founded in 1914, but it voted itself out of existence in 1977 because more and more schools were leaving the organization, disassociating with it, and it couldn't keep going. So it went out of existence in 1977. 12 years later, a new organization was created, the CUMU, the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities. But it's interesting that the title was Urban and Metropolitan, and any number of people were very critical of this, saying, "You're trying to deny urban." I've been very active in that organization, and I don't think that distinction matters that much anymore, but clearly many people thought that calling it urban and metropolitan in order to dispel the negative view of what an urban university stands for. Okay, so, and then I might add that one more manifestation of this anti-urbanism was the opposition of established flagship state universities to opening up urban institutions in the same system. Berkeley fought like hell to keep UCLA from being built. UMass Amherst fought like hell to block UMass Boston. One of my favorites is IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. The mayor of Indianapolis was complaining to the state that we're the biggest city in the state and we don't have a state university. And Indiana University and Purdue University, which were not in the city, didn't want another competitor, in the city. So they got together and said, well, we'll start a university in Indianapolis, and they started IUPUI, whose president reports to the president of Indiana University. And I always wondered how that strange name why would you call a university that? IUPUI is, so, that's another example. University of Illinois in Chicago. There was a lot of opposition from Champaign-Urbana, but then there was also a demand, many people, well, if you're going to build a university up here because so many students need it, build it in the suburbs. Who's going to go to a university if it's in downtown? And of course, Richard Daley prevailed. He wanted it downtown. He got it downtown. And my own institution has some of that as well. There was significant opposition initially to making Rutgers-Newark part of Rutgers. Before World War II, well, it wasn't called Rutgers-Newark then, but anyhow, it's the University of Newark. And then in the post-World War II period, they didn't want the kinds of students who came out of Newark, so that's why they didn't want, let them stay up there, not come down to us in New Brunswick. But then they decided, no, if we don't incorporate it into Rutgers, then all these Jewish students from northern New Jersey are going to come down to New Brunswick. So better we have a campus in Newark and keep them there, these immigrant kids or children of immigrants and the like. So, one other big issue, of course, is how these institutions over the years went about relating to their home cities. And obviously that's the issue of greatest interest to folks here today. Well, one issue is how did they address the needs of city government? Well, one thing is that there was early on a great demand for programs to train city government workers. You know, the premise was, well, the cities are getting more and more complicated, have more and more responsibilities, and nobody has any training to deal with this. And of course, most people got hired because they knew somebody in the machine or, or whatever. But basically, that phenomenon, the need for training, essentially led to creation of the field of public administration. Public administration grows out of the needs of cities and the demands that cities get involved in preparing public workers. But also many urban universities got involved in pretty early on developing training programs for public school teachers. That's another, you know, sort of pioneer area, so to speak. In 1967, HUD commissioned the National Academy of Sciences to report on urban research and how it could be used to address urban problems. And there's a long report that mentions all kinds of things. But again, by the 60s, people looking, you know, these urban universities, how can they address the problems of cities? And in 1968, HUD contracted with the National League of Cities to create a program called Urban Observatories. And they funded a number of research entities within cities, and quote, an idea observatory. The idea was you're going to go out and collect data about what's going on in cities. And so that's another instance of this. By the way, the urban observatories didn't last very long. It was about 6 years it was funded, and the federal government said, oh, well, it'll take off on its own, and then all kinds of other people will fund it, and they withdrew their funding, and they all collapsed. But also, of course, there was the role of universities in economic development, and land acquisition, construction, urban renewal, and this, of course, was very complex and controversial. In many cases, universities were accused of kicking out low-income minority residents. The history of urban universities in the post-World War II period is just full of one after another having these kinds of conflicts at Columbia, at Penn, at University of Chicago, lots of other places. In 1994, HUD created something called the Community Outreach Partnership Center. And its purpose was, quote, to address local housing, economic development, and neighborhood revitalization needs, and to assist consortia in large-scale community building activities. Consortia meaning, you know, the universities would have to partner with local entities. So, and then, by the way, 2009 was created the Anchor Institution Task Force as this concept of anchor institution, the urban university as one of the pieces, if not the key pieces, in building the new economy of cities and of attracting people, attracting businesses into the cities. And finally, I'm just about done. Student community engagement was also an issue throughout, this history. In 1904, the University of Cincinnati created the first cooperative education program in the country, where you would alternate going to school and working. And by 1920, 10 universities offered co-op learning programs. By 1960, 61 offered co-op learning programs. And by 1973, 600 institutions offered co-op learning programs. One of the very important developments that begins in cities and then spreads to all of higher education is this whole notion of experiential learning and of combining the classroom with the external environment. And of course, cities were ideal for that. 1971, the National Society for Experiential Education was founded, so it now becomes a national phenomena. 1985, Campus Compact was founded, and this is a slightly different emphasis from experiential learning. Campus Compact was, how do we get students to build a sense of civic responsibility? And we get them to do service in the community. In 1990, Congress created something called the Commission on National Community Service, which was then renamed the Corporation for National Community Service in 1994. That's been a federal agency. So this issue of engagement of students has a long history, a complicated history, like so many other things. But there's no question that today engagement in the community is a central feature of American higher education, wherever the institution is. And it all began in the cities. Without the cities, we wouldn't have, without urban universities, we wouldn't have had programs to provide massive access to higher education for lower income, working class students. We wouldn't have experiential learning. And we probably wouldn't have had experiential research or local research, research done based on the issues, the communities, the problems, the institutions in one's immediate city. So the one thing, and some of you have heard this already, or heard a lot of this already, but one of the things that has dramatically changed in the last 20 years is the popularity of urban universities. And there are a whole variety of reasons for this, but there have been all kinds of studies that show students who have the choice, more middle class, upper middle class students, more and more they want to go to college in a city, not in the countryside, and not in a small town. And they want the better opportunities for jobs. They also find, homogeneous suburbs kind of boring. And cities are much safer than they were in the 60s and 70s. And there's been a lot of redevelopment in cities anyhow, so that makes them more attractive. So that's another major theme. But my bottom line is much of what constitutes American higher education today began in urban institutions that were for so long considered marginal to American higher education. So maybe that's our way of getting even, if you will. Okay, thank you.
That terrific presentation, and I'm going to open it up for questions. And if you don't have any questions, I have a lot of questions, but yes.
Well, first of all, thank you. That was great. I hope that there is a recording available that they can send it to all the students so they can listen to it about the history. Now, I just have 3 questions, small ones. The first is, the history, the difference between college and university, very basic ones. So I want to know more about that, the history about the difference between a college and a university. So if you have any historical reading, that would be great. And the second also, do you, as you can tell, I'm from Africa, so do you, by any chance, know anything about, urban universities or urban cities in general, and what are your thoughts? So thank you.
Okay, well, with regard to the first question, the term universities in America emerges when schools develop graduate and professional programs. So University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins University, among others. And the term college was typically used for, a traditional undergraduate institution. Over time, in recent years, virtually every higher education institution has taken on the name university. There may be a few colleges left, but most of them now call themselves universities. So the distinction was once a university gives doctoral programs at professional schools, and a college is undergraduate, no more. I don't have any expertise at all on universities in cities in Africa.
Marius.
I would touch on something that you ended your presentation with. Thank you for the presentation. So what do you envision to be the next big impact that urban institutions may have on the entire higher ed system over the next number of years? And the second part to that is, what do you see as the biggest challenge to realizing that contribution?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I have all that much of an answer. Used to say historians are about the past, not the future. But I think one of the... Is it on? Oh, yeah. I think one of the really big challenges, and we all know this, facing higher education is declining financial support. It's really big, and it's very, very, very troubling. And I think it comes from a number of sources. One of them is, this whole tax cut movement starts sort of with Ronald Reagan and goes on. So if they don't have money, you can't charge tuition in K through 12, so universities can charge tuition, let them pay for it. And there's also a growing sense on the part of some people that professors have it very easy, they don't work very hard, they have high salaries, low teaching loads, and also on the part of conservatives, oh, well, they're just teaching anti-American values, and they're all leftists, and all of that. I think, those are the big challenges. Also, by the way, because of demographics, the literature that I've read says that enrollments in the last couple of years have declined a bit, in higher education, not dramatically. But the continuous era of growth is not going to continue. What do we do about it? I don't know. Obviously, universities need to be smarter in terms of how they represent themselves politically, and how we lobby and all of that. But I would argue that, especially universities and cities, might do, well, if not do more in the way of community engagement, and they probably should, but then publicize their community engagement, research, service, learning, opportunities for students in cities, because I think that would resonate with a lot of powerful people. So,
Bob?
Thanks again for your presentation. And I hate to have you speculate, right? But I remember earlier you said something about when you were first looking for an academic job as an historian, and the comment came back that it was sort of not enough history, too much social science. But having read your recent book, let me turn the tables on that. It was great history, but now I want you to think like a social scientist, right? What does all this mean? And what I see, clearly you have shown that through time, one of the patterns that characterizes higher education in the United States is that the status of the higher education institution is very much reflected and communicated by the perceived status of the students it serves in the present time.
yes.
Right? We all know that students today are potentially the elites tomorrow, but if they aren't the children of yesterday's elites, then they aren't considered elite today. Right? Hopefully we still live in a mobile society, but I'm wondering that when you look at the influx of people who a generation ago would have said, no, I won't go to an urban university because I'm middle class, because I'm not a first generation college student. I will go to some of these other places, even if they are in undesirable rural places. But that's where my world tells me I should go. Well, today we're seeing an influx of more people who would have not gone to an urban university in the past. But what we are has been characterized as institutions that serve the people who have been otherwise left out. And yet today it looks like community colleges are playing that role. While urban universities are beginning to experience this shift in who goes to the urban university, lots of people who used to have no other choice but to go to the urban university are going to that community college. And the last 8 years of the Obama administration, they have certainly, we've had federal policies one after the next trying to leverage the community college system in preference to the four-year system. I was wondering what pincer are urban universities facing if what has made us unique is suddenly moving to another set of institutions?
Yeah, excellent question. Many, what we call urban universities, have, like universities across the country, are more and more and more concerned with prestige and rankings. And if you're concerned with rankings, then you want students with high SAT scores and high GPAs and, all of those kinds of things. And I think it is happening in a lot of city-based public institutions that they want to move up in the hierarchy, and they're very concerned with U.S. News rankings, which I think are pernicious. And unfortunately, many of these institutions are trying to get stronger and better prepared, more traditional students, and turning away poorer students. Now, my own institution, at least under my leadership and my successor's leadership also, absolutely, I went to considerable lengths to attract better prepared students by, through our honors college, by advertising, look at what you can learn in the city. Don't you want to get a great education, learn in the city, and come to our honors college? But I also started a program to reach out to low-income students in Newark and get them to enroll. I happen to think that the two are not contradictory. In fact, I think it probably enhances the education of both groups, if you will, to have a range of income and experiential mix in the classroom. So what I'm saying is I think many public institutions in cities are doing the wrong thing by, pursuing this prestige through rankings. And, but that I think it doesn't have to be an either-or for a university in a city, that you can attract both kinds of students. And you can have support program. We have a long-standing support program for low-income students. They get special tutoring in the summer, and then they have advisors who meet with them, and they get tutoring as needed. And it's had a very good, very, very successful over the years. So, there are students who do, from low-income backgrounds who do very poorly in high school, and yet when they get to college, they do spectacularly well. Often the difference between high school and college gives you greater freedom, there's more creativity, there's more originality. They open up and thrive. I think we're probably in the same place on this.
A couple more questions? Yes.
You said something about, what year was that you said that they began to call them universities as opposed to just colleges? Did you make that statement?
Late 19th century. I can't give you an exact year, but by the 1870s and 80s, there are new institutions being formed that call themselves universities. And I'm not sure when a lot of the big publics adopt the term university. I just don't really know. It's a good question. I'll have to look into it.
I guess what my question is now, at this time, you mentioned some of the schools, Rutgers, Boston College, this, that, and other. Do they still consider themselves, they do consider themselves universities, right? Okay. My thing is, I do believe that
Boston College still uses the term college.
Yeah, I mean, they're the...
Of course, there is a Boston University, so that's another...
Boston University, yes, there is. I'm very familiar with the colleges, but I'm saying, when I think about universities, as opposed to just the college term, you talk about universities, and when you speak about higher learning within the college confound, you think about the very word university, universal university or whatever, which you alluded to about how you're opening the door for minorities, you're opening the door for low income, you're opening the door for that. And that's what this whole thing is about. That's what what the university setting is about. I mean, as soon as these colleges begin to be diverse in their, and get diversity into the schools, that right there gives everybody a chance for higher learning, because we learn from one another. We could learn from the different races, the different, and that's how the college strives, not just where the hierarchy, they sometimes want, like you said, the prestige. They want to be known as this great college who has all this money. You got the boosters, you got all these people who contribute, and they have a whole lot of money stacked upon them. But the interest is not with the students. Sometimes, they lose that interest. They lose that criteria where you're developing the students to be leaders of the world, and so they think about it monetarily as opposed to intellectually, and in the growth aspect that these people will do. You got some of these younger people, you're coming in here now, coming to the college, you got doctors who will be great doctors, who might have the cure for cancer, who might have the cure for AIDS, who might have the cure for this, that, and the other. And if they're not getting that, you know, that teaching from the schools, when the schools are in fact just looking at the monetary aspect of it, they're really missing the boat on what they're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Steve. I really enjoyed your presentations, both that I saw. And it's just a comment, really not a question, but you know, you can tell from the way I talk funny that I don't come from here. As a student told me today, I was out in the school, she said, "Where are you from?" "I'm from Australia." She was blown away. "Oh, that's so cool." Anyway, I digress, but I was thinking about the history of Australian higher education, which is so different to the US. You know, the sandstone universities, as they are called, are the prestigious universities that are all located in the major cities, Sydney,
yeah.
Melbourne, Perth. You know, and when I was growing up, there was no way I was going to get access to one of those. My parents were very working class. You know, the cost of attending university was exorbitant. There were no such things as student loans. Unfortunately, the Whitlam government came in 1972 and made higher education free for all students. So I was the beneficiary of that. I wondered if you had any kind of comments on international comparisons and access to higher ed, because until the the mid-70s, working class children had no access to higher ed at all in Australia.
Yeah, well, I think you've said what I would have said. I haven't done any comparative research on this, but obviously access to higher education in general has been, I won't say uniquely American, but you know, has been much stronger historically in this country than in Europe. And you know, again, the anti-urbanism that we associated with higher education in America was not present in the major European cities. In fact, in mainland Europe, so, you know, Paris, Berlin, you know, all of these classic cities, that's where the big universities were located. I wish I had more to say about it, but I just haven't really looked into that. Maybe my next book.
A good next book. Let's have one more question.
Yes, you remember earlier I said 3 and I asked 2. I didn't want to be greedy, that's why I let everybody go. So this is the third one. This is just some clarification. You use a quotation, I guess, of Woodrow Wilson, I think. You use the quote when he just referred to men, that higher education was just for men, if I remember.
Oh, yeah.
So how did what is the meaning here of man? I guess that's my basic questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a very, you know, very important question, because the prevailing view, certainly in the 19th century, was, you know, this is about training young men, not young women. You know, women, they should stay home and do their thing, and, you know, they're not going to be the future leaders. Now, women's colleges emerge fairly early, and, you know, they pioneer in providing education. And then, of course, these normal schools, since they're training teachers, start admitting significant numbers of women. But what Wilson was saying, and it was very much the prevailing view, late 19th and early 20th century, is that college was there to train men, and not just any men, the men who would be the great civic leaders. And that, you know, that was the notion. And there's no question women were not part of that, but nor were immigrants or working class or black men or anything like that. You know, it was, at that point in time, definitely higher education, you know, as Wilson was talking about, it was about elites. How do you get the elites?
Well, I want to thank Stephen Diner for spending some time with us. It was really a treat,
Treat for me, too.
and we wish you Godspeed going home to Newark, New Jersey, and New York.
Right.
But thanks again. I also want to thank Molly Schnook and Mary Smith for putting this all together. Thank you all. And thanks to the audience for coming out. Thank you.